The point of these summits that the leaders hold every once in a while, what are they driving at? What's the result they're trying to achieve?
You know, the summit themselves, when they first started in Yekaterinburg in 2009, I was among the skeptics saying, this is just purely symbolism. Because as you pointed out, when Goldman Sachs created this term and made Jim O'Neill's career in 2001, it was just an acronym. It was just a reference to the 4 largest economies in the world after the G7. What were the next 4 countries on the list? And there was no particular rhyme or reason. Historically, culturally, politically, financially, they're very different countries. India and China are still very poor countries. Russia and Brazil, on a per capita GDP basis, are much wealthier countries. So what do they have in common? Some are manufacturers, some are raw material exporters. What is the common basis for a summit? And as I said, I was a bit of a skeptic. However, I have to admit that I think that the initiative that President Medvedev took in 2009 to bring this group together as leaders makes sense. First of all, within the context of the G20, these are after the G7, these are the next large group of countries, and particularly after welcoming South Africa to join them this past February to make 5. They represent, after all, even now, 20% of the world's output of GDP. And they represent 40% of the world's population. This is not an insignificant grouping. But the question could be, is this just symbolism?
Yeah, but maybe an answer to this question will be if, for example, today or tomorrow, these leaders in China will work out a joint position, a joint idea that they will be later pushing in the framework of the G20. Will this happen or not? What would you say?
Well, my view about international politics is that G5s, 7s, 10s, 20s don't really have much significance. What has significance are individual countries pursuing their interest when they have relative economic and financial power, and when they decide to work with some other country.
So you're the guy among those who believe that only bilateral relations matter. Everything else is just declarations.
Everything is basically declarations. However, when countries, for bilateral reasons, want to work with others to pursue what they perceive as a common threat or a common interest, they can have real power. And therein, I think, is a possibility that you're right, that if they were to get together, if there was some issue on the table, or off the table, more likely, that was of common concern to these 5 leaders in Sanya, they could make a difference. But let's be a little bit skeptical. Let's remember that these countries are very different. And
South Africa made them even more different because BRIC was a good name. It was a brick. I mean, it was something to like Pink Floyd. You can build a wall.
No, that's true. That's
build
true.
a wall.
Good point. Good point.
Yeah. Now it's BRICS. Now it's South Africa. First of all, do you approve of this decision to make it 5? Does this country really belong to this organization? But anyway, when a 5th country joins, means it's already an organization, something to be joined.
I think the addition of South Africa was a little bit gratuitous because I think that one of the features that China, Russia, India, and to some extent India and Brazil have in common is that they are not only large economies, the largest after the G7, but they are creditor countries. They have the money. Now, South Africa is not really in that category. South Africa is still, by African standards, a wealthy country, but by the standards of these other countries, it is still lagging well behind.
Yeah, the diamonds.
But diamond, sure, no, that helps. I mean, it has raw materials just like Brazil, and I think the potential within a very few years to catch up with some of the others. So if we're talking about not the actual situation in 2011, but we're looking ahead to 2015, 2020, then one can understand the logic of going ahead and inviting South Africa to join this group. But let me just underline the point that the more members you have of this grouping, the less likely to have a meaningful agreement.
The less sympathetic it is for people like you who believe in a bilateral.
Right, something like that. Okay.
Listen, but many people still say that there is a special role that the BRICS countries played in the recovery, in the post-crisis recovery. Is it true? Did they play a role?
Yes, I think undoubtedly. If you look at the numbers produced by the International Monetary Fund, it's quite clear that the drivers of world growth after 2008 were countries like China, Brazil, India, Nigeria, and South Africa. Russia, until last year, was not part of that after the sharp drop in GDP in 2009. But even Russia is recovering relatively well now. Not at the Chinese rates, but still quite well. So it is certainly true that these countries have become a locomotive. They have decoupled from what is happening in the you might say, the old, tired, advanced countries of the West.
Analysts see the U.S. economy overtaken by the so-called BRICS by as early as 2018. More now on the BRICS rapid growth in a report by Spotlight's Yelena Demidova.
The factory of the world, that's what China's been called, as it's becoming quite a challenge to buy anything which was not at least partially made in China. Until the late 1980s, its influence in the world economy was minimal. But 30 years later, China is the world's top manufacturer, the second largest economy after the USA, and one of the fastest growing emerging economies of the BRICS. Brazil, Russia, India and China has accounted for a third of the global GDP growth over the last 10 years, letting economists speak of the global economic power shift. The wealthy G7 economies are predicted to be overtaken by the BRICS within the next decade or so. The leaders of the BRIC countries held their first summit in Russia's Yekaterinburg 2 years ago, where they discussed ways to reshape the world financial system. They spoke of the need to reduce dependency on the US dollar. Sometime later, China and Russia decided to use their own national currencies for bilateral trade. The BRIC group has recently been joined by South Africa, the biggest economy on the continent. Goldman Sachs, which coined the term BRIC 10 years ago, expects the major emerging markets will not slow down and by 2020 will contribute about a half of the global GDP growth.
Well, the idea of BRIC was that the emerging countries, as they put it, will develop faster than the developed capitalist economies, becoming more and more independent. Is this happening? Is it really a trend, a crisis?
Not yet.
Not yet.
Not yet. But the potential is really there. You know, the world has been dominated, at least for the last 20 years, by, in economic and financial terms, by what you could call the Washington Consensus. It was a kind of a Keynesian view of the world that government had a role, but the private sector should be left to do what it wants. Anglo-Saxon model, right. Obviously, since the 2008 crisis, this model is somewhat discredited. And so these countries come along with very different cultural, political, and economic traditions and say, wait a minute, we don't necessarily want to follow individually or collectively the Washington Consensus. Now, they don't have anything to replace it with yet, but the potential is clearly there.
Says Martin Gilman, the former senior resident representative of the IMF in Moscow and a professor of the Higher School of Economics. Spotlight will be back shortly after we take a break, so stay with us. We will be back with this interview in no time. Don't go.